This is bigger than multiple sclerosis. This is more than folks with MS. You've maybe seen the numbers. Different people have done them. Dr. Zavadnov, when he did them, he talked about his are the lowest numbers, but he had the highest numbers of people studied. If you looked at the people with MS, at least 58% had them, but there was a sort of a plus or minus 10 group that had already been handed over to the so-called normals. And the normals was about 20%, 1 in 5. What does that mean when you have CCSVI but you don't have MS? Well, I suspect it means that you could have several other conditions. Conditions like Chiari, many of you won't know it, or hydrocephalus of undetermined origin, or worsened spina bifida. Many of you will have heard of that. Certainly we know that transient global amnesia, these are the unlucky people that wake up in the morning, they're my age or even younger, and they have no idea who they are. If they're lucky, it comes back. But that's recognized to be CCSVI. Many of you have given statements already tonight that it can make a huge difference to anxiety and depression. I think we're going to find CCSVI has a very important piece in the mental health of people. Not just MS people, but other people. So then we're on to the issue of excess iron. It's documented, and I had that study in Buffalo. It documented and shows in their studies that if the people, normal people have this much iron in the brain, and it all, of course, goes up with age. I'm 57, I'll save you doing the math. And then if you have MS, you have more iron in the brain. And I had even more than the average MS person for somebody 57. The other illnesses that have excess iron in the brain, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and stroke. We have nothing to offer those illnesses today. We have a tiny temporary 2 or 3 year window that we seem to help Parkinson's, but the same drugs that help may actually worsen it. Okay? So that's why I'm very excited to go to Italy to hear about this issue about iron. Now, it was alluded to by our young gentleman who's starting the Maples facility for ultrasound, but the Hakey protocol. Mark Hakey is a physicist. He's a Canadian, or at least he's a joint Canadian-American. He works out of McMaster University in Ontario, and he works jointly out of Wayne State in Detroit. And he has written the so-called Hakey protocol. He's written papers about this excess iron in the brain and how critical it is. Who cares about iron in the brain? Does that just mean you're hard-headed? No, it's not that simple. Excess iron in the brain is felt to happen due to the back pressure of blood because it can't readily flow out through the venous system. If you measure the pressures on the opposite side of the relative obstructions in us, then you will find that it's usually double what normal is. And if you measure it in millimeters of mercury, if normal is 4 millimeters of mercury, and then abnormal is 8 millimeters. It doesn't sound like a big difference if you're talking about it being 4 and 8, but that's double. And if I doubled your blood pressure, everybody would get uptight, usually pretty quickly. The other piece, and some of you will have watched the Monk lecture online, which was, I think, the 27th of January. It was in Toronto. It was extremely well attended. It was done by a vascular surgeon from the University of Toronto. Reasonably well done. He missed a few pieces, though, I think, that are really important. Although he alluded to the answer, he downplayed the issue. One was the issue of back pressure and so-called hypertension and high pressure in veins. This is known to happen regularly in medicine. High pressures in veins in the head and neck, and that's when we get a cancer in the head and neck, or we have an injury and something goes awry, or you get healing abnormal after surgery of the head and neck, and then you sometimes get major blockage of veins from the neck, and you get suffusion. You get an extra big face, so to speak, because you get edema of the face, the same as you can get swollen feet when you spend too long in an airplane. All right? The other piece that happens when you do that, when you look at the back of the eye, and he showed these examples in his talk, is that you can see extra big vein blood vessels in the back of the eye. So he used that as a point to say that this doesn't happen, or we'd be seeing those things in MS people. But he did allude to maybe the issue is most of those people only live for months or years, or they get it treated, okay? Even now in Canada, if you were in a car accident and messed up your jugular vein, you could get it treated, all right? And that's because, you know, you don't have MS. Now, I've got one friend in Vancouver, her MS worsened to some degree after she had one of those injuries, and it is neck positional for her. When she moves her neck, her MS symptoms aggravate, all right? So the piece that he didn't talk about was the importance of that chronically elevated venous pressure or venous hypertension. Most of us don't get MS in our teens. We can get it sometimes in our teens now. I've seen a young fellow at age 11, and it's happened as young as 5, I believe. But most of us get it in our teens, sometimes 20s, 30s, 40s. I was 42 when I was diagnosed finally. So the chronicity, or the length of time you have the relative blockage, aggravates the feature. The premise being, again, it's relative back pressure squeezes red blood cells across the so-called blood-brain barrier and deposits them around the veins in the brain. And this is where the plaques happen. And that is why this is not a new idea. As many of you will have read on the web and through Facebook, Charcot, literally the father of neurology, the famous French physician, described MS more than 150 years ago. And he said, all of these lesions we find on autopsy are centered by a vein. Now, that is the king of neurology, even to neurologists. And the idea wasn't let go for the very longest time. It kept coming back to the fore, coming back to the fore. Schelling and others, Tracy Putman, who was a very big wheel MS neurologist with the MS Society in the United States, even in the 50s, was very big on veins problems being part of MS. And then, of course, what's been suggested happened in the mid-50s. We got the science of immunology. And all of a sudden, things shifted, and we decided everything was going to get solved with immunology. And sometime not long after that, we started to talk about maybe MS is an autoimmune disease. And we didn't let go of that. I've now let go of it, but people aren't going to let go of it easy. Autoimmune disease and MS is not really well documented or confirmed. And gosh, we've been looking at it 30 and 50 years, okay? But the ideas aren't going to change. What happens when those red blood cells back up into the brain is that they cross the blood-brain barrier, and then the red cells usually break down. Breakdown of red cells, the iron attached to the hemoglobin is released as free iron. Free iron outside of the blood vessels is very nasty stuff. It causes a lot of oxidation. If any of you have ever bought a car from Southern Ontario that's 2 or 4 years old, you will know all about iron and oxidation, rusting. The same happens in our brain. And when it happens in the body, we call it oxidation and free radical production. So it triggers the whole cascade, and it triggers big-time inflammation. Now, I've heard a number of neurologists speak, even in the last few months, and there is no argument that MS is primarily an inflammatory condition. So the inflammation occurs, the red cells break down, a group of white cells called macrophages go in to mop up and clear up this breakdown of material, which they normally do everywhere in the body, and eventually some of the immune response is seen to go there. But it's a secondary or third thing. So I think that it's later in the game that we see the other. But we do all agree on the inflammation piece.